And we are coming back at you live. Hello, everyone on the World Wide Web. It is so good to see you again. So good to hang out with you again. Thank you so much for everyone that's been tracking with us through 2020, through 2021. This has been already a whirlwind of a year. We are already into June, which is so wild. But before we get too far into today and too far into June, just wanted to take a minute to say hi. My name is Chad. I'm the Director of Outreach for To Write Love on Our Arms. I'm here on behalf of an amazing team of 19 individuals, plus some interns that are just starting today to meet their staff. Hello, any interns that are watching. And yeah, we're thrilled to be here with you for our roundtable conversation for Pride Month. So we do have a little bit of housekeeping to get to. First and foremost, if you're watching on Facebook, we are live in the comments, in the chat there. You're going to be speaking with Katie from our team. Feel free to say hi to Katie. Feel free to drop any questions that you have throughout the day into the comments, and Katie can help funnel those our way for the conversation. If you're watching on Twitch, then you are hanging out with our buddy Aaron. Say hi to Aaron. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in there. Let's see, where's my announcements? Okay, so for those of you that have been tracking with us for a bit, you know that last weekend was our 9th annual Run For It 5K, and it was a smashing success. It was all virtual this year. And even though it was all virtual, we had the biggest year ever. We had over 4,200 people moving for something that matters. Beyond being active in their communities, active within their own family and friend units, we also were able to raise $145,000 for hope and help. That is so far beyond any of our metrics, any of our goals. I think we started the campaign hoping that we could raise $85,000, and through your help, we were able to smash that. We can't wait to put that money to good work to make sure that we connect as many people as possible to options for hope and help. So again, thank you so very much. So this is now Pride Month, and we could not be more excited to bring to you a number of conversations through a number of different platforms. So today, obviously, we're having this roundtable conversation. You'll meet our panelists in just a bit. We have a new podcast that's dropping on Tuesday. So if you don't already subscribe to the To Write Love on Arms podcast, you can get that wherever you download your podcast. So on Tuesday, you'll find a conversation that we've had with Dr. Amy Green from the Trevor Project, and also our friend Jessica Straight, who has been a blog contributor for a number of years. It's been one of my favorite episodes that we've done, so please check that out. We also have a new Pride merch collection that's going to be dropping next week. I am not allowed to show you the designs yet, even though I really wanted to, but keep an eye on our social media, on the emails. If you're a member of our community text line, definitely keep an eye on that. That's where we'll be dropping those links first. One thing I can show you is we have some new tie-dye units coming your way. We have a number of different options. Every single one is completely unique. We have our gray title. These were all hand-dyed and bleached by our very own Ruthie Haskell. We have a deep teal tie-dye title. And then we also have an option just called surprise tie-dye. These were a number of shirts, a number of different designs. And here's one example of that. It looks super sick to me. So basically, if you select the surprise tie-dye, that's going to be any design that's not our title design. But we are dropping those tomorrow. Again, keep an eye on all of your social medias, on all your emails, all that jazz. That's how we talk to y'all. So let's see here. We did that. Again, we do hope to take some questions today. So if you have a question, please drop that to Katie in Facebook or Aaron in Twitch, and we'd be happy to get around to those. With no further ado, I'd love to bring on our panelists. 1, 2, and 3. Excellent. So here we have a collection of friends, old and new, and I've been looking forward to this day for so long. So we have Kartika. I'm going to let everyone kind of introduce themselves, but we have Kartika, we have Bree, we have Ryan, and again, I am Chad. But I guess we'll start it off here. Who are all of y'all? If you wouldn't mind going around, we can start with Kartika. If you wouldn't mind just sharing where's home, how do you spend your time, and what inspired you to take up this path for mental health advocacy and care? So let's start with Cardi and move on around.
Okay. Hi. Hello, everyone. I'm Kartika. Very excited to be here. Very grateful for this space. My home is in Mumbai in India, but home right now is Edinburgh in Scotland. I was an intern with To Write Love in the spring of 2020 and stayed with them through the summer when the pandemic hit us. And I'm now a psychotherapist in training, and I'm studying here at the University of Edinburgh. I think I spend my time mostly in school, and this year has been hard with the pandemic and with the way the world has been looking like, and it's just been hard on my training as well. So, yeah, I'm just glad to have a space to talk into this very important conversation, and I look forward to it.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kartika. And moving around to Bree.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bree Barnett. I am the Director of Advancement at Trans Lifeline, where we are proud to be the largest direct service provider to trans people in North America. We run a peer support and crisis hotline that's staffed entirely by trans people for trans people. Home for me is in the East Bay, so in Oakland, California, or actually I just moved to Berkeley, California. I need to make that mental adjustment. And home for Trans Lifeline is actually across North America, serving the US and Canada. And we have always been a remote organization, including since before COVID. I like to spend my time when I'm not running communications and fundraising for Trans Lifeline. I like to get out there. I like to play basketball with my friends. I also like to watch basketball. I am a trained mindfulness facilitator. I haven't been able to do that as much during quarantine as I would like, but it's something I love. And I also like to hang out with my partner, our dogs, eat some popcorn, the good things in life. And what I got started on this journey of mental health advocacy and care is really seeing the impact mental health takes when you are part of a marginalized population, the hate trans people experience. I've experienced it. I myself have struggled with suicidal ideation as a result of just feeling like, this world doesn't necessarily have a place for me in it. And want to be able to provide resources on scale for our community to connect with each other.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Bree. And Trans Lifeline is a network that we have been proud to partner with in the past and on into the future. And this is just one aspect of it. Bree, thank you so much for making the time to be here. And on to Ryan.
Hey, y'all. So home for me is in Portland, Oregon, just north of Bree in Oregon. And I originally, though, from Houston, Texas, which still has a big piece of my heart. I'm the founder of Mental Health Match. We're a free service that helps match you to therapists and counselors who best meet your needs, including matching on budget and insurance, expertise, and different types of cultural needs as well. And I actually came to this work. I used to be a communications consultant in social change groups, doing a lot of messaging work and thinking about how do we really bring together different audiences, but also create change among people. I kind of came up in my career during marriage equality movements, but then worked on a number of things related to immigration, racial justice, and as well as transgender issues such as how do we get health plans to cover gender affirming surgery for folks. But then I realized how important mental health care is actually to the well-being of people and to social change. And I realized how hard it was to find and connect with a therapist who really worked for you. I kind of came at it in my own moment of crisis and just got so overwhelmed and was talking to people about like, how do you go find mental health care? And I heard a number of folks and a number of my friends say, I actually just gave up. Like, it was so hard to find a therapist. I just gave up on it. And I thought, something's got to change here. And so I waited a few years for somebody else to do it, and nobody else did. And then decided that I would try to start something different. And so we were founded a couple of years ago, and we've been growing ever since. So to date, we've almost matched 100,000 people to therapists who best meet their needs.
That is incredible. So Ryan and I first got connected through Mental Health Action Day. And again, shout out to all y'all that had a hand in making Mental Health Action Day back on the 20th of May. Just such an amazing success. And we love meeting new friends. It's a pleasure to call all of y'all friends. And with that being said, we love to hop into some roundtable discussion. So at any point, anyone feels free to answer first or pass the baton, have at that. I'm really just here to ask the questions. So with no further ado, let's get right into it. Naming the elephant in the room, we're now about 14 months into this pandemic, into this cultural shift, a time that's really shifted our sense of community, that honestly robbed us of so many opportunities to come together, to celebrate, to learn more about each other. What are some of the ways that the pandemic has affected your life and your community, specific to the intersections of queer identity and mental health?
I can speak if that's okay.
Yeah.
Before I do that, I just realized I missed the last bit of the question for the introduction. And I just wanted to say that what brought me to my training in psychotherapy is my own individual journey with my struggle with mental health, and being there and experiencing how hard it was for me, finding help, the whole process of acceptance within me and then acceptance outside of me. I think also the society that I lived in and the shame and that guilt that came with accepting that. And now being able to look at it and see how far I've come because of the help that I found is what brings me to my training and to be able to give back. It's for me, it's like a calling. It's something I think I need to do with my life. And that's why I'm here. And to come to your question, Chad, what was the question again, if you don't mind?
Yeah, so the question is, just with the context of the pandemic, how did this past year, with limited access to social engagement, to just hugs and high fives and all of that, how did that play out specific to queer identity with you, your community, and mental health?
Yeah, I think this year's been so hard. I can't stress enough. I think for me, more so moving away from home, being in a whole new country. I think I've been in 2 continents over the period of this pandemic. And it's incredibly hard because I think for me in my life in general, having a community is so important. I think it's where I find my strength. And something that keeps me afloat, I would say, through life. And being in a whole new space and living in the isolation of it has been really hard. Not having access to hugs, like you said, is something that I need. I think that's just what I need on most days. It's been really hard not having access to that physical comfort, that sense of knowing, getting to know people in a way that you feel connected to them, building those connections in a new space. And even so, like in my training as a therapist, it's just been so hard to take care of my own mental health while I do that. And I think what this year taught me is more so to, I think, learn about what you need and learn to honor that, even if that feels like that's perhaps not what someone else needs right now. It's just a sense of learning who you are and what you need with the world that you're living in. And I think having compassion for that, it's not easy. It's not easy at all. Some days are just so isolating. The disconnection of it feels so frustrating. I think even in my training, my course has been mostly virtual. And I think it's the first batch in my course that is training to be therapists virtually. It's so hard. It's just so incredibly hard to build that space for someone when you're not physically in a room with them, and to be able to hold that for them. It's just so hard, but also to realize that you are also a human and that you also need to be held through that process. And so I think all of that has been really hard. I think just saying that it's hard feels like an understatement. So yeah, it's been really, really hard. And I think I've just learned to honor every day in what it asks of me and what I feel I need to just be in it. And I think it's just so exhausting because we've been in the survival mode of, okay, how do we survive this collective grief that we're experiencing? So yeah, I think it's been hard.
For sure. Bree, how has this played out, I guess, specifically with Trans Lifeline? You mentioned that your coworkers have always operated in a remote way. How have you seen, was there any kind of correlation between the pandemic and the types of calls or the frequency of calls that were coming in? How did this pandemic affect your community?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, and really for teasing out the types of calls, because that's what we've seen a huge shift in over the pandemic. Is we're now answering 40% more calls where people are actively considering ending their life. Just the elevation of the average call has gone way up. That's because for the trans community, this pandemic has really just kind of turned up the volume on existing inequalities, and things like isolation is something the community experiences a lot in normal times, not being able to get out there, connect with people, find new community for fear of discrimination, and then you add shelter in place on that. When it comes to issues like domestic and intimate partner violence, normally trans people, 54% of trans people report being in an abusive relationship, either with an intimate partner or a family member they live with at some point during their life. And then during the pandemic, during the peak of the pandemic last year, we saw calls regarding that issue increase 300%. Just, really alarming numbers. Another example being, if you're in a community that's been targeted for medical discrimination, you feel like doctors don't understand you and your body, we saw a 100% increase in callers talking about fear about being able to access medicine. So again, these are all things that the baseline's high, the baseline's alarming, and then the pandemic just made everything that much worse. And it's really been taxing, especially when you don't have, there aren't a ton of community spaces for trans people, but the pandemic also took away what few there were, took away in-person support groups, other places like that for folks to meet people. It's been really hard for the community, but I also do think it's worth mentioning some silver linings. We've heard of a lot of people using this as an opportunity to say, if I make it through this, how do I want to live the rest of my life? Using it as an opportunity to come out, using the isolation even of quarantine as an opportunity to experiment with new clothes, try out HRT for a few months, and then kind of see how it's working for you in a way where it's a lot more removed. Other people aren't going to be seeing the changes you're going through as much in the day-to-day. So it's been really hard, and also there have been some opportunities for people to really come into themselves during the pandemic as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. Brilliant, perspectives. And first, I've heard of kind of the two sides of the coin of isolation and pandemic, quarantining and whatnot. I'll stop talking so I can get to Ryan. Ryan, what did you see? What did Mental Health Match see as it pertains to gender identity, sexual identity, and mental health throughout the pandemic?
Yeah, I think isolation and shame just exacerbates those underlying inequities that Bree was talking about. So, we saw at the very beginning of the pandemic, there was spikes in people searching for help with things like substance abuse, family conflict, and then kind of in the middle of the pandemic, we were seeing a lot of financial stress. People not having the money to be able to make ends meet, worried about their futures in that way. And now we're starting to see like a huge spike in eating disorder requests. And all of these have to do with the inequalities and shame that that society puts on queer bodies. And I think that really kind of brings these things out even more. The isolation has been huge. A lot of queer folks have community on a dance floor and build community around the dance floor because that is a safe space for us, and that has gone away. And as much as a virtual dance party has attempted to try to bridge that, there is no replacement for being in a room with people. Same thing for in-person support groups. I know a lot of people who do group therapy, and the folks who started in groups before the pandemic and who met in person with their groups were able to kind of continue that thread remotely. But it's really hard to start a group, and build the group dynamics that you need for group therapy in a remote situation. And so we kind of just keep seeing these patterns play out. And the isolation has really, I think, exacerbated some of these things. I think about especially queer kids who are at home in unsupportive families. I think about queer folks who have roommates or housing situations that they feel unsafe in, and not being able to leave those to go to find safer spaces. And I think about all of there's just the validation that happens when you are in a room of like-minded folks and who can see you and really see you, and how hard that is to build online. And I think that is the cause that we're seeing play out in the spikes in things like, requests for help around eating disorders, suicidality, conflict, and things like that.
Yeah, for a follow-up on that, and I'd like to start with Ryan on this, and then whoever else can jump in as they feel welcome. But, we believe, and I think I can speak for this entire panel, that it's important to have access to avenues of care where you don't need to defend or explain your existence. How have barriers to those points of care affected your life, and how are you making those efforts to kind of break through that sense of isolation that existed before the pandemic? Is kind of what you were hinting at there, Ryan. Not even hinting at, you were just saying the social dynamics of being in a non-affirming community. So how have those barriers affected your life, and how are you taking steps within your various projects to make those pathways to care a bit more clear?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think about a few years ago going for, just routine HIV testing, and going to a place where I felt so much shame for being sexually active, for being queer, and for basically hearing that it's like that disease is one's own fault. And that really kind of stuck with me a lot. And I think that, Bree was talking about this too, of like just a distrust or fear of medical providers. And then we saw that again this time around too, with a lot of blaming folks who were positive for COVID, or trying to blame behaviors and putting a lot of shame on people. And the way that affects people's interactions with medical community. I also see that a lot with, in searching for therapists or for mental health. There's a lot of ways out there that actually are really discouraging, that they kind of accent and really bring out more of that shame and stigma. I see that a lot of around kind of like some of these online providers, and kind of the questions that you go through, just answering about who you are. And then there's just a lot of discouragement along the way. And so, what we try to do with Mental Health Match is just make it more affirming of a process where people can go through and connect with a provider, really understand providers and where they come from. I mean, it's interesting. I think my own experience in mental health, like I've had therapists where I did not feel safe talking about my queer life, or having to explain things, or being mislabeled. And then I went the other way, where I was like, I'm only going to go see queer providers. And they actually was some of the worst therapy I've ever been a part of. Like, they just didn't meet my needs, but I stuck with them because they were queer. And so I think that there's this middle ground of making sure that you can find a provider who understands you, who has training and experience with people like you, where you can feel visible and understood, but also provides you what you need.
Yeah. Let's bounce this to Kartika as the psychotherapist in training.
Yeah, I think I agree with a lot and everything that Ryan said, in fact. And I think as a therapist in training, I've learned it's important to have these conversations with your peers, with your colleagues, and also with yourself, and do the work that do the work for your clients, and do the work for just honor everything that your client is, and that's everything, like hold a space for the person that they are, and but also like be sensitive and informed to how these identities influence and affect people's lives, but curious about what they mean to the person you're seeing, and so to honor the person. And I think also to have these conversations in spaces like where you're training, and in these educational in these institutions that are making these therapists, if that makes any sense. But that sense of having those conversations and bringing that into your training and talking about it, and sensitizing, being sensitive to it, and in yourself, like doing the work, and not just, I get that whole conversation. Okay, you hold space for the person that shows up in the room, but you also hold space for their identity and everything that affects their identity. And this has to do with systems, like systems of oppression, unjust and unequal systems that exist. Because, and I believe like people, like, and especially when you're in the fragile process of discovering your identity, or an identity that you don't feel safe enough to share with the world, that it's important for you to have a space that honors what that means to you and where you are in your process with it. So it's important to not have assumptions about how this looks for any one person, because every person has an individual journey with it. But also to recognize that it's not you who needs to be fixed. It's these unjust systems and structures of oppression that are responsible for your pain to a large extent. I think it's just heartbreaking that a world exists where this has to be a struggle, where an expression of who you are um, has to be a place where there's shame, there's guilt. And I just think that that itself is heartbreaking. And as a therapist in training, I think I just do my best. Of course, I don't know everything, but I do my best to remain sensitive to it, and to have these conversations with colleagues and peers and just people you interact with, because I think that's so important to do as a provider of care.
Cardi, I love that idea that it's not the job of the marginalized person to make all the changes to make sure that they feel safe, that you feel safe, that we feel safe. Bree, do you have any additional thoughts? And then I think I'd like to go to a question from the audience after your thoughts, Bree, and then I'll even give you first stab at the audience question if you want it.
Thank you. I mean, yeah, I've had similar experiences to Ryan, to Kartika. Like, it can be incredibly difficult, incredibly isolating. I'm fortunate, I'm relatively privileged geographically to live in the Bay Area, where there are more service providers for trans people. And it's still just so difficult to navigate sometimes. There's so many barriers, financial barriers. We know 29% of the community lives in poverty, and yet mental health care can be so expensive. And then, when I was coming out, I would go to training facilities and be paired with people and kind of have this attitude of scarcity, where I just kind of needed to be grateful for whatever therapy I was getting, even if it wasn't actually meeting my needs, including working with people who despite being so well-intentioned, identifying as allies, being excited in theory to work with a trans person, when we get to talking, they wouldn't understand my issues. They'd call my gender dysphoria body dysmorphia, things like that. One therapist thought I, wanted to misdiagnose me as I was going through just the highs and lows of the coming out process with cyclothymia, which is on the bipolar spectrum, but is actually incredibly rare. And I was actually kind of rolling with, oh, maybe that's a diagnosis for me, until I was in a support group with 6 other trans women. And I mentioned this, and 4 other people there had also received that misdiagnosis suggested from a therapist for something we know exists in like less than 1% of the population. Like, it's a relatively rare diagnosis, and for just like 4 out of 6 trans people in that room to have been given that, I think really speaks to the way where even if you are able to access resources, they aren't necessarily going to be great. And then kind of as a result of that, went through a similar process to Ryan, where at first I only wanted to see other trans women like therapists, of which there was like 1 in my region, and she was great for like the coming out stuff. But eventually, when it came to processing trauma, other things like that, that wasn't her strength. That's just like not really what she does. But it took me several years to feel comfortable like leaving her and seeking out another service provider. And all of this is with the privilege of being able to access these things. Another thing I really want to mention that I think kind of uniquely impacts the trans community is the fear of non-consensual interventions when speaking to service providers. So because of mandated reporting, sometimes even if you get someone who does understand you, the fear that you can't really talk to them about where you're at if you are experiencing really active suicidal ideation, because you're afraid they might involve the authorities for you. For a trans person, that could involve being put in a misgendered psych ward. It could involve interactions with the police, that we know police are more likely to discriminate against trans people. It can be really dangerous. And so then you keep that inside because you don't know who you can turn to. And that's why at Trans Lifeline, we're really focused on providing blanketly accessible services, and also saying, we guarantee caller anonymity as our way to get around these mandated reporting laws. So even if you're in process of making attempt or something, like, we will not even be able to call the authorities on you unless you want us to, unless you actually share that information. And that allows people to have really brave, really honest conversations with us about exactly where they are.
Yeah. No, thank you for explaining kind of how the call center works, how that operates, and kind of the philosophy behind it. There was a question from the World Wide Web that I'd love to get y'all to weigh in on. It's actually a couple questions that hit on a similar theme. The idea of, oh yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but before we go away from this topic of medical providers, can I say one last thing?
Yes, please.
There are a number of statewide bills being advanced right now that are directing what kind of services medical providers can provide to trans youth. And that I feel like we can't get away from this conversation without naming them and naming the harm that those are causing and the way that they are stigmatizing folks, but also shaping medical providers in what they feel is right or what they should do.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I happen to live in a state that is going through such policy, if you even want to call it that. So yes, please be aware of the context that you are living in, and ways that you can add your voice, lend your voice to making sure that our friends and family remain safe and cared for. We'll get back to kind of what affirming activity looks like in just a bit. But for this time, I'd love to hear y'all weigh in on some questions that we've had about people wondering. We've talked about being in caring social environments, what it looks like to be on the dance floor, what it looks like to connect with a therapist that you feel like gets you. But how do you respond to people who are questioning you about your sexuality when you're exploring it? What are the steps to go through about correcting people when they ask questions that might not even be any of their business. I won't even say might be, that just not any of their business.
I can weigh in here as someone who I think at some point or another has identified, I think literally with like every like letter in the alphabet. I've identified as a lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, transgender, you name it. And my experience of that fluidity of identity is that these labels are helpful as much as they're helpful to you as an individual, right? And other people, unfortunately, even within the queer community, we have our biases, we have our discriminations within the community, I think, especially like bi people, queer people, pan people, you know, sometimes face stigma, especially. And so, you know, if you're navigating that, I think it's always really appropriate to set the boundaries you want to set. And even if it's as easy as saying, you know, I'm not going to answer that question, or, you know, if you want, you can give more information. I think these things are ultimately like to be judged on the basis of your individual relationship and how much you're interested in really investing in that relationship. Is this someone who, you know, maybe this is an inappropriate question, but you're close friends, and so maybe you want to start off by letting them know why it's an inappropriate question, but you may or may not want to answer it anyways. That's your call. But if, you know, especially if it's a stranger or someone for who it's just entirely inappropriate, I think you're really giving them a gift if you set that boundary and you say, hey, this is inappropriate and this is why. Like that's a moment of education. You also don't even have to go that far. Like it's always okay to not answer. And whether it's in response to these questions or your own questions, it's also always okay to not know. It's always okay to like not be sure which label is right for you, to be like in process of figuring things out, experimenting. It's so very, very deeply okay.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I think, sorry, I just wanted to add to that, and I I agree with what Bree said, and in that sense that it's a very personal process, and just to say that it's your process, and you get to decide who you share it with, and it's completely right for you to correct someone if you feel that it's inappropriate for them to be asking you that question. And so I think, yes, but I also want to recognize that that can be anxiety provoking for a lot of people, you know, setting that boundary, saying that I don't want to talk about this, or just being asked that question can be anxiety provoking when especially when you're in a space where you're exploring that's part of you. And so I think it's for people to be sensitive enough to not ask that question when it's inappropriate, and just to know that to respect people's boundaries, and also to be open to be corrected if you find yourself asking that question and you're corrected in it, to then be sensitive to that, you know, because it is in general a very personal process for everyone. And it's about what your intention in asking that question is, and just I mean, it's not a casual question that you ask out of curiosity. It's about being sensitive with what comes with it and what that can mean for anyone that you're directing that question to. And so just to recognize that it's not easy to set that boundary, but it's important for you to do so. And it's very, very valid for you to correct someone if you feel that it's inappropriate that they're asking you that question.
I'm reminded, one of the things we do is we share stories about that people submit about kind of their own experiences in therapy. And there was one of them with we call it Voices of Therapy, but one of them was somebody who talked about kind of exploring their sexuality and coming to the realization that they didn't need to label it to be able to explore and understand it. And I think that is the case here. Like all of these labels are kind of like guideposts, you know, they're there, but you don't need them. You can go around them, you can go between them. And yeah, it's just kind of coming back to that story of of that, people want to label things and put things in boxes, and that's not how human beings work, especially when it comes to gender or sexuality. And so I think that was a wonderful story. And I think whatever you feel safe with, like Kartika and Bree were saying.
Yeah, I want to take a second to acknowledge Kartika. She wrote about this very same thing in a blog that ended up being a shirt for us of "Who I Am is Human." That there are aspects of you, but these labels are not you. You are something more complete. You are something worthy of going beyond or in between, like Ryan was saying. Any of these guideposts, you are human, and hopefully in time we get to know your name and your story and get beyond what any of these labels may be. I want to get back to what Ryan was talking about, specifically with law, with policies, with bills being brought forward, and how that plays into conversations of affirmation, of being affirming places. We know from research that our friends of the Trevor Project have conducted that if an LGBTQ plus young person has even just one affirming adult in their lives, that their mental wellness improves significantly and their risk of suicide decreases. From your experience, what can and should affirmation look like?
I mean, I think it should look like so many things, letting people know they're safe, they're loved, they're welcome, that these labels are really important to who they are, but that if they share them with you, that person's extending an invitation to you into knowing them more authentically and more fully, and coming to those conversations with gratitude as much as possible. I think sometimes affirmation means standing up for people too. It means speaking out if you hear other people, for example, misgendering them or making homophobic or transphobic jokes, just like letting the room know that that's not funny. Being like putting your affirmation into action. And I think that also extends, especially right now, to the policy realm. I think my heart breaks for trans youth right now and their families who want to be supportive and who want to be affirming and say, we see you, sweetie. We love you exactly how you are. We're here to advocate for you, and we promise you there is a place in society. And then to have politicians try to break that promise that a parent is making to their child and try to legislate that there isn't a place for them in society, and just, imagining like that trans youth navigating like, oh, how can I feel welcome at school knowing that I'm not going to be able to participate in sports with my friends? How can I feel like my life will be affirmed if I can't access the medical care that I really need, and that I've talked to my parents, to my doctors, and we all agree this is needed. This is necessary. I think there's something really so sacred and special about a family making space for their queer and trans youth. And there's something just downright evil about society as a whole trying to get in the way of that and insert themselves into those conversations.
You could have just dropped the mic. You didn't have to spike it. Thank you so much, Bree.
Yeah, and I would add that it's being seen, right? That like being seen and being loved and understood. And I think that that's something that's really important, is like that visibility aspect. So, okay, it's Pride Month. All these companies love to put up their rainbows right now, and they love to make statements like, "We love you no matter who you love, or no matter what your gender is." And to me, that's erasure. That's like invisibility, right? And it is. There's a part of it that reminds me of like the All Lives Matter statement. And it's like, yeah, sure. But what we're trying to do is raise visibility for a certain segment, for a certain group of people. And so maybe that does mean saying like, we love gay, bi, queer folks, we love trans folks, we love, non-binary folks, like actually saying the words and showing that visibility, because otherwise I think it just kind of is partly erasing it under and not showing people or giving them the words that allow them to feel reflected and seen and understood.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, I think the question of what affirmation looks like, I think affirmation looks like honoring the story that the person is sharing with you, honoring and respecting the identity and not questioning it. Affirmation looks like, I think, just taking what is told to you to be true of who's telling you that. So it's this sense in a therapeutic space. I mean, there are these conversations of, is mental health political? Of course it's political. Of course, like laws, policies, systems that exist affect mental health. If I don't have access to financial resources, that's going to affect my mental health. If I'm struggling with injustice of some sort, that is going to affect my mental health. And so the sense of being a care provider, being a therapist in a room, I think it's so important for me as well to acknowledge that and not take a neutral stand about it, the sense of, oh yeah, okay, policies exist, but like, let's talk about your mental health. Well, my mental health is political. Who I am is affected by what is around me and how the world treats me and what structures affect me. And so it's so important to have that conversation about, yes, mental health care is so important, but it's so important for mental health care providers to acknowledge the systems and how they affect us and our identities. And affirmation looks like that as well, affirming what the person shared. I think I feel so honored to be in this profession, because like a lot of people coming to me are perhaps experiencing a safe space for the first time in their lives, perhaps come to share parts of them that they haven't shared outside of that space before. And for me, that's an honor, but also something I don't take lightly. And so it's so important, I think, affirming someone in who they are and how they experience themselves. And I think one way I look at it is not approaching someone from who you are, but seeing who they are and what they bring to you. And so it's not like, okay, I think or I assume or I'm seeing your reality, because there are as many realities as there are people, and that is a fact. You're never going to know how life is like for someone else, as you can try to get as close to it. And as a therapist, that is my role, and that is my profession, to try to get as close to you as I can, but also to be able to meet you from you rather than trying to assume and meet you from me. And I think that's what affirmation looks like.
Yeah, it strikes me that affirmational relationships are not transactional, by definition. It's not about, there has to be more than just meeting in the middle so that we both can get by. It has to be about continuing construction to make sure that we are getting through this and getting above it together. We talked a bit about, some of the bleaker dynamics that this pandemic has brought about social implications of gender identity and sexual identity. I want to switch it a little bit, not just to excuse some of the darker, the heavier parts, but I am curious, where do y'all currently see hope at the intersections of conversations of LGBTQIA plus peoples and mental health? Where can we see, well, I hope it's brighter than just a silver lining. Hopefully we have a daybreak coming, but where are you seeing hope in these conversations? Or if we're not done, taking a wrecking ball to the barriers, we can also talk about what are the spaces that need immediate change.
I really am seeing a big shift in, I think, societal understandings, especially around issues of transness. I don't think it's happening fast enough. I don't think the people who are most impacted, especially, Black and brown trans women, like sex workers, are fully seeing the benefit. We have so far to go. But the basic framework, I think, is shifting. And, I don't want to make light of the awful bills that are happening and say that they're a good thing. But also, I think it's worth observing that we're talking about trans people in sport and the right of trans youth to access healthcare because they lost the fight on bathrooms. Like, society now more or less agrees that trans people deserve the right to like go pee like everyone else. And let's just be clear, that's a low bar for like participation in society, like the right to go to the bathroom. But the focus has shifted because these groups that are putting forward these bills, they're super well funded. They run focus groups and they lost that fight. So I think there are shifts happening, and what's important is that we not allow those shifts to allow us to become complacent, that these shifts are happening because people are getting involved, because people are redistributing resources directly to communities who know what they need to fight against them. And we're going to keep that hope going. We're going to grow that hope by continuing to invest in those communities.
Yeah, I would say that I think, the shift of like social media and what that's brought has allowed people to kind of build community in different ways. And I see so much hope there in the way that community has been created in online, and the way that people can go directly to each other or directly to community groups that are doing amazing work. I mean, I think that brings me so much hope. I see a lot of the conversations around mental health happening. I think, and I think, Bree is right. Like, we just went through 4 years that there was a lot of political power trying to keep us down, and we're still here and we're strong. And that I think has rebounded back. And I also see a lot of, I see a lot of hope when I observe people of older generations. And this is totally anecdotal with like my own family, but like my 90-something-year-old grandparents were asking about a friend's pronouns the other day, and it blew my mind. And my dad, who, I had a rough time, coming out and acceptance and like all of that stuff. We were at a wedding and he was dancing with a male identified person in a dress. And it was like, it was just brought my heart like so much joy just to see some of those little like interpersonal changes that I've just noticed in my life. And I think, 10, 15 years ago, I would never have imagined either of those things would have happened.
Yeah, I think just taking from what Ryan said, I think for me, hope is in those little spaces that I experience in life, every day. It's just people caring about and having these important conversations. It's this space, like we having this conversation here today. It's also me, having mentors and being in my training and seeing that space there for, people and the inclusivity there. And again, not to make light of the struggle that's still there and exists, and the problems that are still like that are being faced by the community. But there is hope in that sense of also me, the work that I put in my training, and the kind of therapist I see myself becoming gives me hope in that as well. So it's about doing a little bit, and I think there's the hope in that fight, if that makes sense. Like keep like fighting that fight, and the small wins that you get on the way. Of course, it's just the basic, like Bree said, it's like having access to like a bathroom, and it's like the basic. It's a very low bar, but there is hope there, and I think it's worth holding on to those little wins, and hopefully living in a world someday where we don't have to fight the fight.
For sure. I want to be clear in that at no point are we believing or assuming that we have represented every identity of every audience member or people that may one day see this video. We're also not claiming that we have a monopoly on any of the answers, on any of the resources, on any of the stories. So I want to turn it back to y'all, and please be self-dealing again for the organizations you're representing. But let's try to build out a bit of that Rolodex of hope, that Rolodex of networks, of mentors, of books, of blogs, of safe spaces, really. what resources do y'all believe that LGBTQIA plus folks should be aware of? And maybe even open that up to what resources do you think allies should be aware of as we continue to craft a safer, more equitable society? As we're thinking through some of those resources, again, definitely want to highlight the individual work that Trans Lifeline is doing, and our friends in the Trevor Project as well. And also, if you give a listen to our upcoming podcast, you're going to hear a few more ideas as well. But I'd also love to know if there's any resources, books, blogs, podcasts, whatever that y'all believe to be valuable resources.
I spend a lot of our time on Instagram. So there's amazing Instagram accounts to follow. Obviously, like, Instagram is not mental health care, but there are amazing therapists out there who do a lot of affirming content and just sometimes can provide a lot of hope. So I really like, there's the queer sex therapist, the fat sex therapist. Both of them are just amazing in affirming that I love following their stuff. I also really, really appreciate Rachel Cargill for a lot of what she does, both around the intersections of bodies, sexuality, and race. I think that there's a lot of learning and understanding and inspiration that comes from their account as well. So I think, finding those little pockets on social media, I think we were just talking about that, is really, really great.
Great. Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I also think, there are these whole little subcultures that form. There's like trans Twitter, there's like trans leftist Twitter, there's like, subcultures within subcultures. And I think there's some really amazing places to find folks. I want to shout out a side project of Trans Lifeline that's really been us getting involved in the Twitch space, which is called peer-to-peer.live, which is a directory we created of Twitch streamers with marginalized identities. It's a tagging system. Twitch has now rolled out their own tagging systems. Ours doesn't have limits. So if you want to find a Black autistic trans streamer, like, you can stack those tags, and it's a tool to make that available, because I think having role models, having other people out there who share the same interests as you, and also they happen to share the same identities as you, that really matters. And, I think for allies, these are great sites too. There is a lot of content being put out on Twitch by activists who are educating at like the intersections of their identity. I always try to avoid recommending single voices, because I think there is no single voice for a community. But like, I think once you like get into these ecosystems of thinkers, be they bloggers, people on Twitter, people on Twitch, Instagram, or authors, a lot of them reference other people, especially within marginalized communities. I see we do a good job of shouting each other out, and then that gives you more people to follow. And the more trans perspectives you're having, the more Black trans perspectives you're having and are exposed to, I think really the better it will be for informing your own advocacy and developing your own analysis.
Yeah, I think social media is a really good space, especially like I've encountered therapists on social media talking about, the effects of societal structures on mental health. And I think those voices, like Bree said, like it's an ecosystem that you enter, and that you find voices that are within that, and that as allies as well, to engage with that conversation. And I think social media can be a really gift in that sense if you use it wisely. But also just to say that for access to resources, and when you're like finding a right therapist can be a very exhausting process. Sometimes it can be very it can be very demotivating, especially if it's a long process for you. And I think it's also about knowing and feeling valid in your sense that you haven't found the right space for yourself, and that you're allowed to say that this doesn't feel right for me. And so the first time you see a therapist or the first time you go to therapy is not you committing to that space, but you trying to figure out, is this going to work for me? So it's about you exploring that relationship with your therapist. And it can look like your therapist honoring your pronouns, using them, your therapist asking you just questions and reaching you from a space that feels safe enough for you and feels like you're being received in. And I understand that it can be really exhausting when you don't find that space, but I think there are. It's also okay for you to ask your therapist if they're queer affirmative. You know, do they have what in the sense of like asking those questions of, will I be received in this space for who I am and how I am and how I show up? So I think just acknowledging that you have agency there and that you have the right to ask those questions is really, really important. And a lot of times therapists on social media also they do display that they're queer affirmative, and that's a whole network where you can find more therapists that can work with you in that sense. And I would just say, like, there is it is really, really exhausting when you don't find that space, but also because just asking for that first step, asking for help, is so hard for so many people, and not finding that space can be so demotivating. But also know that you're allowed and that you deserve to find a space that feels safe enough for you.
Yeah. You know, Kartika, this is we just put up on our Instagram this morning at Mental Health Match like five tips to know that your therapist is the right one for you. And so it's such a timely conversation. And I would add to that and just say, like, sometimes therapists claim things that aren't always exactly the truth. So it's like, this happens a lot with, like, they'll say like, oh, I'm trauma informed, but like not fully realizing what that means. And we see that a lot with like queer affirming too, is like therapists will be like, oh, I'm queer affirming, but they don't have the experience to really actually be queer affirming. They don't know what that looks like. And so beyond asking if they're queer affirming, I would ask about, like, how are they queer affirming? Do they have experience working with folks that look like me or talk like me or live like me? What values do they bring into their process as a therapist, and how do those align with being queer affirming? So kind of dig deep, and it's like, you should absolutely ask those questions of a therapist.
Yeah, I want to hop back on the soapbox of transactional relationships and say that a transactional relationship in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. I have a very lacking transactional relationship with my beard barber at the moment. But when I see them, there is a purpose for that relationship. I exchange money. I get a bit more fitted in the face. Counseling is, at the beginning, a transactional relationship. You are investing in therapy in order to find ways through a specific trauma, in order to make sense of the world around you, in order to learn more tools. And the hope is that just because you start a relationship transactionally, it can grow. It doesn't have to keep that same label throughout. You can get a sense of unconditional positive regard as well. All of that to say, if at any point you don't feel like you're getting what you need or deserve out of a therapist relationship, you can look for other options. You do not need to keep going back to a well that feels dry. If I could be so bold to to say that, and then I'll shut up again.
It's true for most of the relationships in your life too, by the way.
Yes, great.
Yeah, and I also think, like, it's important to say here that this relationship you have with your therapist is also a relationship, and that beyond, yes, there is that transaction, and yes, there is that space and that boundary in that space, but also that it is supposed to feel relational. And different therapists, also to mention that different therapists have different approach to therapy. And there's the cognitive behavioral approach, and then there's the person-centered approach. And so the sense of testing the waters, if I may, and to see how it relationally feels. The sense of it's also the sense of tapping into yourself, and you would know when it feels safe enough with a therapist. Like something in you is going to tell you that, and just to be able, and also to realize that sometimes people seeking therapy are in very vulnerable spaces, and it's not always easy to be able to make that decision for yourself. Oh, and it's very easy to belittle yourself in what you're feeling, in the sense that, oh, am I expecting too much, or am I having, or like Bree said, at least I have access to therapy, so I should be okay with it. That's not the case. I mean, it should feel it should. It is also important to acknowledge that therapy can often be like a privilege. It's hard to have access to. It requires financial support, and it requires you being able to reach what you need. But also knowing that it's okay to say that this space doesn't feel right for me, and that you have other options, and that it's not just because you have access to therapy and you found a therapist that, okay, you have to be in it regardless of whether it's serving you or not. And so there's that sense of it is a relationship, and it has to feel like it's serving you.
I think I just add on there specifically with the topic of therapy, if you're watching and you really know that it's not accessible to you for various ways, I think I really don't want you to shame yourself for that, for whatever the reasons. I think there are so many support networks that can be just as helpful or affirming or as insightful as therapy. And it's really okay to reach out for help, be that from an anonymous service like a hotline like Trans Lifeline, or be that from friends, and to trust your friends to let you know if they don't have capacity or not, that you aren't being a burden by asking for what you need. Ever. And then I'd say the flip side of that is I think sometimes there's also this mental block that can happen where it's well, maybe I have the means for therapy, but because it's such a privilege, that means I shouldn't access it. And just want to say, don't go too far in that direction either. It's if you can afford it, it might be worth checking out and seeing if it's helpful if you find yourself struggling, especially if you know the specific things you're struggling with. You don't have to feel guilt. Don't let the guilt of being able to access it keep you from accessing it, but also don't let the guilt of not being able to access it keep you from reaching out and trying to find other ways of supporting yourself.
Great. Thanks so much, Bree. We're rapidly approaching the end of our time together, and I absolutely lament and hate that. I would love for this conversation to go on forever, but I know that I don't get to determine y'all's schedules. I'd love to leave it with, I guess one round of kind of open mic. Anything that you wish we would have touched on that we hadn't, anything that you wish to express that you haven't yet done, I step away and offer you the entire internet.
I think I just want to say something to what Bree brought in, which I feel is so important, to know that therapy is not the only form of care that's available. And it's very easy for us to often talk about mental health in terms of therapy and, seeking therapy, but that there's so many other forms of care. There are perhaps if you have supportive relationships in your life, or you can find support groups and other spaces that make you feel safe enough to share who you are. And I think that's so important to talk about, in the sense that just not feeling like you don't you lack something if you don't have access to something, and knowing that you can still ask for help and find help in other ways, and that it doesn't always have to look like therapy. So I think that was very important. A very important thing that Bree said there. But also, just one thing I wanted to say is just because we're talking in about Pride Month and about identities, I just wanted to say that, and I know this is a big thing to say, but just to people who perhaps are in processes where they're in those spaces and questioning or exploring their identities, that I know this is a big thing to say, but I just want to say that there is a world out there that will accept you for who you are. And I truly believe it. I truly believe it. And I know it's disheartening, and it can feel really hard to not be accepted. But just to let you know that there is a world that will accept you, and it's okay where you are in your process, and how you choose to go through it and who you choose to share it with. But also know that it's important for you to find support. Like you said, that one person in your life who will show up for you and who will see you for who you are. And also to acknowledge that it's hard. It's hard to share those vulnerable parts of ourselves, but to know that it's important for you to feel supported, and so to find that space. And yeah, there is a world out there who wants to celebrate you, and it's not, I'm not saying that it's easy. And a Pride Month is so much more than just celebration. It's also acknowledging the grief and the shame and the struggle and everything that comes with it. It is a celebration of identity, the way I see it, but it's also acknowledging all of it, like everything that you are. And it's okay if it doesn't look like anything that someone else is, but there is space for you. I think I just want to say that.
Yeah, I'll pick up that theme and say wherever you are in your journey is also so okay. You don't need to know. And I also just want to say I really believe and trust your assessment for yourself on whether or not it's maybe like safe for you to come out, or whether or not like you need to know right now. I'd also offer, as I was saying earlier, all of these identities, all of these labels, all of these things, like they're as useful to you as they are useful to you. And they don't need to be more important than that, which is not to downplay like how structural oppression related to these labels impacts us, but just like at the individual level, it's about what feels right to you. And then finally, I just offer to someone who maybe isn't sure whether or not the world will be affirming of them, to say, no, it's true, there are affirming spaces. It also may be true that coming out might make your life harder. I know in many tangible ways, it made my life harder. It made my life kind of like objectively worse, especially in the early stages of things, in terms of just like, being forced out of a job and like dealing with family rejection, stuff like that are things I had to navigate. It also became a lot better. And as time has gone on, I've been able to like move past those things. I can't guarantee that it will be easy for anyone, but just to say, sometimes I think it's easy to get into your head that hanging on to some privileges you might get from not coming out somehow outweighs the benefits. And at least my personal experience, and the experience of many other people I know, is that it may not get better in every way, but there's a lot of possibility, and it's really hard to put a price on being able to live your life the way you want to, because ultimately you're the only one who has to live that life.
Yes to all of that. You matter. Like you matter, and you're important. And we think sometimes that these feelings are going to last forever, like tough feelings are going to last a really hard time, but you get through them. And you are not the only one out there. There are people who are like you, even if you've yet to discover them, but they're there. And so trust yourself, and just remember that you're important and that your life matters.
Excellent. Kartika, Bree, Ryan, thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Twitch. Thank you, Facebook, for watching. If you're curious about learning more about Mental Health Match, about learning more about Trans Lifeline, about any other LGBTQIA plus resources, please keep an eye out on our website on TWLOHA.com/find help. We have a tag specifically for LGBTQ plus identities and some resources that we found. And that's a list that continues to evolve. If you were watching and you know of some things that we should look into, please tell us. We are all in this together. This is all a family endeavor. We know that May was Mental Health Month. And we know that you can't just constrain mental health conversations to a month. June through April is also a mental health month. As much as it was that, June is Pride Month, but so is July, August, September, October, November, December, all the way around. You don't need to put a timetable on your experiences or your identity. We will be there to help point you in directions of hope and help, regardless of what day it is, regardless of what you're experiencing. From the bottom of our heart, we're glad you're here. Thank you again to Kartika, to Bree, to Ryan, to all y'all watching, all y'all sharing, all y'all being part of this with us. We can't wait to continue these conversations throughout the rest of the month and the year and into eternity. With that, we bow out of this conversation. We will see you again real soon. Everyone be good.